Since I haven't been, preaching for about 5 weeks, this is going to be a long sermon. I got to catch up for 5 weeks. No, I'm kidding. So as many of you know, one of the first things I did when I entered into church work is I worked with teenagers in the Roman Catholic Church. And these kids, our youth group alone was 300 kids. And so we took the kids on a retreat to the Prescott, Arizona, and we rented out the entire camp. And I had just started getting my feet wet into this group. And the theme of the retreat was Ephesians 4:1. I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. And this text became one of my most favorite texts. And it's one of those texts that has guided me in my ministry and what I do as a priest, but also just as a human being. In this text, we hear Paul, or somebody, one of Paul's followers, depending on who you think wrote this, saying, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. Well, what is that calling? We kind of spend our lives looking for what is the meaning of our lives? What are we supposed to be doing? And yet, Paul makes it quite simple for us. Paul says, here's what you need to do. With all humility and gentleness and patience, bearing with one another in love, and making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. This calling, as we are discerning where we are to go in our lives, should always be rooted in love. Whether that we are called to be pastors, or whether we're called to be evangelists, whether we're called to be engineers, or whether we're called to be nurses, or whatever our calling is in the world, whatever we are doing, if it is rooted in love, we are doing what Paul is asking us and commanding the Ephesians to do. Love is not always messy. It can be messy is what I mean to say. Love can be messy. And sometimes in love, we say things that hurt one another. And sometimes we do things that hurt one another. But acting in love means coming to the person and saying, I value our relationship together. Please let me make it right. And providing forgiveness and acceptance of that forgiveness of one another. And then Paul goes on to remind us, there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. No matter what our calling is in this world, we are connected to one another. There isn't just Episcopalians over here. There isn't just Roman Catholics and Lutherans and Methodists, Jewish and Islam. Rather, we are all connected because there is one body in God. There is no outsider in God's body. There is no exclusion in God's body. We are all interconnected. For the past 18 months, our world has lived in a very interesting state. We've been told to separate. We've been told to not be in contact with one another. We are told to wear masks and keep socially distanced. And the one thing that I got to tell you has spoken to me loudly from this COVID pandemic is how truly interconnected we are. As a society, as a community, as a world. The actions that I take as a member of this body has an effect on everybody else. The actions that I do, whether not be a mask or wear a mask, or whether I choose to be vaccinated, and I'm not getting into that, but has an impact on the rest of us. How we treat one another has an impact on the rest of the world. It is so easy in our lives, and I am guilty of this myself, where I focus on what I want, and what I need, and what I desire, instead of what does the community want, need, and desire. And Paul is reminding us that, yes, we get to have those desires, but what we desire is within a communal context. What we do is for the betterment of our community and our world. And everything we do should be rooted in love. I had a conversation this last week. Believe it or not, Lance had a show this week, and I go to all his shows. And I was standing outside, wasting some time, because Lance gets there like 3 hours before. And I was standing outside, and this young man came up to me, and we just started having a conversation. And one of our friends walked by, like, "Hey, Padre, how you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, you're a priest." And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, great, let's talk religion." And I looked at him and I said, "I'm on vacation." He goes, "I don't care, let's talk religion." And so we sat there and we had this conversation about religion and how religion had hurt him and how religion had ostracized him and excluded him from the greater good, and how he grew up in a certain faith tradition that didn't like the fact that he was gay, and he was actually excommunicated from the church on the spot and was told that God no longer cared about him. And he's telling me this story, and I looked at him and I said, "I'm sorry, but that's not the God I know. The God I know, the God I've studied, the God that I look at in Scripture, the God that I work for is not that God." And he goes, "But they said that they were doing this in the name of faith. That their faith commanded them to say this to me." And I said, "Well, I believe everything we do needs to be rooted in love. So here's how I see it. If your faith is telling you to love one another and accept one another and be a part of one another in community and to build one another up, I believe that's from God. If I have a belief system that tells me I need to hate and exclude and tell people that they are wrong and everything else, I'm in the wrong neighborhood." I said, "So what do you believe?" I said, "Do you believe that you're living your life as best as you could and as true of who you are? Are you caring for other people? Are you, praying for other people? Are you worrying about other people? Or are you only worrying about yourself?" And he kept telling me a story, and he was a nurse, and, he works in elder care and all this other stuff. And he goes, "I just think every day I'm doing the right thing." And then I said, "Then you're good with God." If we live our lives rooted in love, how can we not be doing what God is calling us to do? I just made him an archbishop, not a presiding bishop. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry. I think he should run for archbishop personally, but Michael Curry has his famous quote, "If it's not about love, it's not about God." If what we are doing is not rooted in love, we are not in the right neighborhood. But as I've told you before, love is not easy. Love is messy. Community is messy. Living in our world is messy. Lance and I took a week and we went down to Mexico. And we went to this church, this little beautiful little chapel right on the ocean. And the priest stood up and he said, "This is a Roman Catholic church. And even though we are Roman Catholic, God's table is welcome to everyone. Come and receive communion." I kind of wanted to walk up and I was like, "Does the Pope know you said that?" But what a beautiful imagery. And isn't that what we try and do here? This house, if you drive past County Road 6 here, you see our big electronic sign. You see in God's house there are no exclusions. Because at the fundamental principle, basic thing that we do here at St. Edward's is love. And love is what makes this church operate. Love is what we strive for. We've had members of this congregation, or people come to visit our congregation, who are of all different backgrounds. We've had men, we've had women, we've had different ethnicities, we've had Democrats, we've had Republicans, we've had independents, we've had gay, we've had straight. We've had people who were Jewish and Islam and Buddhist enter our church. And do you know what I've heard from so many people who have visited this church? This community made me feel welcomed. When I applied at St. Edward's, and actually I think it still hangs up in the office. Somebody hung my resume up in the office. I don't know why. And especially that's a picture of me at 400 pounds. I'd rather take that down, but the scripture quote that I put on my resume is to equip the saints for ministry. And that's what we do here. We don't always get it right. It's not always pretty. But our job here is to act in love to equip the saints for ministry. So this week, think about what is it you're being called to. Is it maybe helping the homeless? Maybe it's buying some backpacks for IOCP. Maybe it's serving this community through the Altar Guild or through the lecturers or whatever. But what is it that God is calling you to do? And how are you going to do it in love? Because if we operate in love, we can't go wrong. Amen.